Hey everybody, welcome to It's Not Scary, It's Just Music. It's me, SJ. Hey, welcome to 1989. The decade's officially coming to a close, can you believe it? It feels like just yesterday we were starting off in 1980 talking about the promise of new wave and synth music and how it was going to change the face of everything, and it did, but in 1989, we're not even really talking about new wave or synth or anything like that anymore, right? Because the music has just evolved so aggressively since then. It's been an amazing journey. And as a result, I look forward to capping the whole thing off today with 1989. Before I get going, though, I want to talk a little bit about next week's episode, which is going to be the official first season finale of the It's Not Scary, It's Just Music podcast, which is amazing. In that episode, I'm going to be wrapping up the entirety of the 80s from beginning to end, talking about all of the major genre groups that have existed and evolved during this decade, and calling out specific songs that were milestones along these genre trend lines. So it's going to be a long episode for sure, and I look forward to all of you listening to it. So before we get going with 1989, I just want to remind that any of the tracks that I discuss in today's episode will be on my essential playlist for 1989 that is linked in the description of this episode. Or if you're interested in listening to my bigger list for 1989, which has the full albums that I referenced today, or the conspicuous absences, or any of the other albums that I decided to keep but didn't mention here, all of that is on my big list, which is also linked in the description of this episode. So, as always, we're going to talk about music trends, what's moving in, what's hot right now, and what's moving out. Next, my essential albums for this year and why, and then finally, my conspicuous absences from my essential list and why. So, what's moving in this year? I think we talked a little bit last week about alternative and underground rap. So, there's been quite a number of albums that have come out in the last couple years in 87 and 88 that have been, at the very least, playing with being an alternative to popular rap, which is either pop rap, which is definitely a thing that we have not been talking about in great detail. I think we talked about some of it in our conspicuous absences last year because there's a lot of pop rap that is happening right now. And then also gangster rap, which is the strongest genre of rap going right now. So juxtaposed to that, there's alternative rap and underground rap. So alternative rap and underground rap are both moving in currently. They are not quite on trend yet. I would say give it another year or two, and they'll be on trend with some of the albums to come. But absolutely moving in, certainly not actually underground, even though underground rap sounds like it should be underground. It eventually bubbles to the surface and retains its name. So both of those subgenres are on the way in. Next, the second wave of American punk, which what we think of Green Day, for example, it's on the way in, but it's not quite in yet. We had one particular album that I would say brought punk back to the fold and brought people's attention back to it in a meaningful way that helped to inch it along towards the inevitable full rise of bands like Green Day, but we're not quite there yet. Next, R&B as an idea is highly in flux right now. I would say that there's a lot of ideas that are currently moving in, but of all the waves of contemporary R&B that we've been talking about over the last several years, they're just all swirling around each other right now. Like the first wave of Prince and Luther Vandross, like that's still kind of in existence. The next stage after that, the Shaka Khan era, and then the initial Janet Jackson era, and the Whitney Houston era. And then even this year, there's, I would say, another step forward in that evolution. And so R&B is not currently landing very softly at any one place at any one point in time. There's just a lot of ideas aggressively bumping into each other. And so it's just tremendously in flux right now. So hopefully over the next few years, we'll start to coalesce around some consistency. But for right now, it's all over the place. And we're going to hear that even in today's episode with at least one example. Next, the second wave of pop country. It is certainly moving in. And I would say the second wave of pop country is, as I've said previously, like your Clint Blacks, for example, your Garth Brooks is a really great example of that. He might even be the next wave after this, but it's clearly moving beyond the initial Reba McEntire, Dwight Yoakam initial era, and we're stepping into the next phase of pop country. So we're inching along there, not quite on trend yet, but we're very, very close. And then electronica finally is on the cusp of becoming on trend. It's not quite there yet, but your house, IDM, EDM, trance, all of those are extraordinarily close to being on trend. I would say one more big album in 1990, 91, and we're going to be right there. But in 1989, one album in particular came out that pushed us so close to the edge of being on trend that our hand is on top of the plateau, on the top. We're not all the way up there yet, but we've got a hand up there for sure. So what's hot right now? The second wave of alt rock continues to be the leading edge of rock music right now, and there's no real sign of it getting replaced anytime soon. I would say that knowing what I know about early 90s rock, grunge will inevitably come in extraordinarily soon and create some definitive boundary lines around what rock music is for the next few years. So we're on the cusp of it shaping up a little bit more than it has been already, but it's already essentially in the form that it's going to take for a minute. Next, gangster rap. I think if you listen to 1988, you know that the entire gangster rap genre was thrown for a loop. Although there's still a second era of gangster rap to come. Think about Notorious B.I.G. and Tupac Shakur, and then Ice Cube going out and doing his solo career. That's going to be the second wave of gangster rap, which is a gentle evolution from this current era that we're in right now. So it's not fundamentally different. It's just going to change a little bit. But regardless, this sound is going to be on trend for the next several years, even if, as I perceive it, Straight Outta Compton was a peak for that genre. It will start to level off a little bit, and then it'll go up a little bit more when Biggie and Tupac come out, and then it'll start to move its way down in favor of other predominant rap ideas, but we're not quite in that zone yet. And then the second wave of hair metal, we talked a little bit about it last week with Jane's Addiction. I would say that bands like that are certainly giving a clear indication that we're almost done with hair metal. So there's actually a conspicuous absence this year that is going to typify how the entirety of hair metal is going to be leaving us soon. At the very least moving out, but more than likely it's just going to skip moving out and go right into the ground. So we're almost there on that one. And then finally, what's moving out? Honestly, there's a lot of stuff that just, as I just said a minute ago, skipped the moving out phase and just went out all the way. Like the first wave of hair metal, gone. First wave of neo-traditionalist country, gone. Like I said, R&B is all over the place. At the very least, the second era, the Shaka Khan era of R&B skipped over a lot, and I think that there's a lot of artists that are overwhelming that era of R&B so much so that you might as well just put it in the ground, but there's still a little bit of life to it, and it's not quite agreeing to go in the ground and have dirt thrown on it just yet. And then that first wave of alt rock, like I said, I think at this point, it's not even moving out. It's just officially in the ground and ending. So it's very interesting that in 89, I would say there was a lot of cleaning house that was happening across genres, because as we know in the next couple years, as we start the 90s, things aggressively kick into the next phase, kind of like what happened with the 70s, where disco just kind of ended, and then we were just in this new thing with new wave, just changing the game all over the place. But there's still going to be hangers on, right? Like alt rock is going to evolve into grunge as the preeminent rock sound. So because of that, similarly to the beginning of the 80s where punk was still happening, but it evolved into 3 or 4 different other things, it's going to be the same kind of thing. But to do that, the genre plate had to be cleared a little bit to make way for these other sounds to find a foothold. So that's everything that's going on in the music trends. It's pretty wild stuff, how aggressively things are changing right now compared to even what was happening in the early 80s. So it feels a little bit like the winds are aggressively changing again. So let's hang on and keep an eye on all of these different genres because they're shifting aggressively. So next, let's talk about my essential albums for the year and why. First, I had mentioned this a little bit about the American punk movement coming back. So Bad Religion, No Control. This to me is that next wave of punk rock in the United States. This is a tremendous album. A couple of different things to pay attention to for this album specifically is the harmonies that are being used. It's the melodies and the intonation, all of which are highly melodic compared to previous punk rock iterations. Like think about Dead Kennedys. There was no melody. There was no intonation. There were no harmonies. And if they were totally incidental, or it was done in a tongue-in-cheek sort of way. This is actually nearly pop music in terms of how consumable it is. All these tracks are still talking about counterculture, still talking about revolution, talking about hard-hitting topics. All the songs are about 1:20, so it's definitely punk music, but it's just highly, highly consumable. And I would say, too, that bands like this, not specifically just Bad Religion, but bands like this that were emerging to the forefront in this moment were in truth ushering in that next era of highly, highly, highly consumable punk music, which a lot of punk traditionalists would consider to be pop punk, but certainly more hardcore today than even the punk of 10, 15, 20 years further on than Green Day. So it's just the next evolution of punk rock. So Bad Religion in this case embodies it almost perfectly. This album too is just nothing but hits. I called out 4 just because these are 4 that I really enjoy, but the whole album is tremendous and essentially like this. But Big Bang, No Control, the track, Automatic Man, and Billy, to me, are all really great examples of that melody, those harmonies, the layering of actual singing and not necessarily just sending a message. Like, it's sending a message, but it also is enjoyable for your average listener to consume. So those 4 tracks are really tremendous. The whole album is like this. I would say that this is one of the easiest albums to listen to of the decade, just because the songs are really easy to consume. Like I said, they're really, really fast. They get the point across and then they get out of there. It's pretty excellent punk music to a T. So give that one a listen. It's really great stuff. Next, Clint Black, Killin' Time. This is absolutely second wave neo-traditionalist country, or pop country, however you want to think about it, country pop. And this to me is that ushering in of the next wave of country. And there's a couple reasons for that. Clearly, Clint Black is adding off of what Dwight Yoakam started several years ago with his debut album. And we're just going even more poppy than that at this point. Like, A Better Man and Killin' Time are the 2 tracks that I call out specifically. They are, and this is not necessarily a dig on Clint Black, but they are so by the numbers country music at this point that there's a literal formula to making pop country that even still exists today with pop country, and you could hear it in Killin' Time, specifically that track. It sounds exactly like 90% of all pop country tracks of this variety for the next 40 years. It's extraordinarily standard. Like I said, it's pretty paint by numbers. And I would say this is a super early example of it, where Clint Black is coming in and really setting that standard for the next several decades for how pop country is executed. So if you want to enjoy some early markers of that movement before it starts to stagnate over the next several decades, then go enjoy this album. A Better Man is also another by the numbers pop country track, but it was one of his first monster hits. Killin' Time is also one of his monster hits, but A Better Man, I would say, was playing a large part in bringing country to the radio, even more so than it was before, centering whole country radio stations around what Clint Black is doing here and trying to find other artists that could do the Clint Black thing. He's pretty much signaling that this is the way popular country music is going to be going forward. And he is absolutely not wrong, because it is literally still that way today. So this is one of the early beginnings of that. So give it a listen. Next, Faith No More, The Real Thing. So this is second wave hair metal. It's kind of towards the end of it, as we've been saying. This is honestly even more like pop metal than it is just straight ahead hair metal. If you compare what this is to Def Leppard, Faith No More sounds way more poppy than Def Leppard did several years ago, even a couple of years ago. There's a few interesting things about this album beyond the fact that this is really ushering in the next iteration of heavy metal in the 90s that is just straight ahead popular metal and not your subgenres or your more deeply underground varieties of metal. For example, rap metal. You can really get a lot of rap metal listening to this. And when we say rap metal in this case, think Red Hot Chili Peppers sort of variety. And then obviously the hair metal part, and then the funk metal. So the rap metal, the funk metal, that's all, like I said, the West Coast Red Hot Chili Peppers vibe. If you want to think about a really, really big example, that's what you can think about when you hear those subgenres. the tracks From Out of Nowhere, Epic, Falling to Pieces, and then the cover of War Pigs. So all four of those are really excellent examples of how Faith No More is bringing a lot of these disparate subgenres of metal together into one album. And like I said, in a way, it's clearing the table a little bit on a lot of these metal subgenres being popular and trying to bring them into one cohesive set of ideas that can be a roadmap for other popular metal bands to come out and find a foothold with audiences. Those four tracks are really excellent. It's also a really good sign, too, that this iteration of hair metal is sundowning because, like I said, there's a lot of experimentation going on with a lot of different ways to merge hair metal with other ideas so that we can leave the straight ahead hair metal ideas to the wayside and blast off with these newer, more effective ideas. And Faith No More really pulls a lot of those things together. It's really great stuff. Those four tracks are really excellent. Give them a listen. Next, Janet Jackson, Rhythm Nation 1814. This is pop R&B. As I've said, I'm kind of giving up on giving it a wave number or calling it contemporary R&B because this is straight ahead pop music with R&B elements to it. We've been saying across the entire decade of the 80s that R&B has been working towards finding its pop connection points. And at this point, across all the albums that we've been enjoying in the R&B space, I would say that we could just officially kind of call this pop R&B at this point. This album specifically is why R&B seems to be in such flux right now because it's aggressively innovative. Rhythm Nation as a track, State of the World, Miss You Much, and Love Will Never Do. All those four tracks are A, very different from one another, and B, really continuing to toy with what was, what is, what could be. I would say in many respects, Janet Jackson is tapping into old school, mid school, and current school Prince. There's a lot of playing around with rap and rock and electronica and R&B all at the same time. I think she's not as aggressively experimenting like Prince had over the last several years, and she's just more focusing on taking all of those elements and going back and honoring the R&B conception with this album. It's, to me, a really great way to end our viewpoint for the decade for R&B, just because, again, if you look back at what happened in 1979 with Off the Wall and Prince by Prince, and then listening to this, just listen to how far we've come with R&B just in this 10-year period. It's wild. Just Rhythm Nation as a track, wild. Miss You Much. Miss You Much sounds like a track that should have been 5 years from now. And it's clear that she was setting that standard a couple years ago with Control, and now she's taking it to the next place with Rhythm Nation 1814, and it's just tremendous stuff. This is a really excellent album, and I love so much that this is, I would say, the end of R&B for the 1980s as we're starting to think about what comes in the next decade. So really great send-off, I would say, to 80s R&B with this album. Just amazing stuff. Next, Julie Cruz, Floating into the Night. This is avant-garde pop. We've been talking a lot about avant-garde the last several years and how it's really been finding its way into rock and pop and alternative and metal. This is just another really great example of it. It's really heartening to hear and see that avant-garde in its many, many unknowable facets is being accessible enough that we can call it pop or call it accessible rock or what have you, because the avant-garde artists are often the ones that are the most aggressively pursuing experimentation, and Julie Cruz is doing it. The two tracks, Floating and Falling, both of them, great. The things to call out here, she's really doing an excellent job of crooning. I think that with Shadowlands, Katie Lang, a year or two ago, she was bringing in a lot of that really excellent sound, that crooning idea, and merging it with several other concepts in order to create that tremendous album. And I think that Julie Cruz is continuing to go on that journey with her album as well. I also want to call out that she is helping to usher along a lot of that quiet, contemplative, underground, and indie set of sounds that we know to be fairly prevalent in the early mid-90s. So she's really moving those sounds along too and allowing them to find a foothold for later artists. So this is pretty influential stuff. I'd give those two tracks a listen. If you like those two, keep listening to it because it all kind of sounds like that. It's really good stuff, and it's albums like this that make me really excited for what's to come in the next decade. Next, Jungle Brothers, Done by the Force of Nature. This is alternative rap for sure. We've been talking about them being alternative rap since their last album that we talked about. The only track I'm going to call out here, Doing Our Own Dang. So the reason that I call out this track specifically is it pulls together all of the big artists of alternative rap that are about to emerge, like Tribe Called Quest, De La Soul, Money Love, and even Queen Latifah, who I wouldn't necessarily characterize as alternative rap because she definitely has a gangster rap edge to her. But you've got a lot of the pieces and parts here. Brand Nubian isn't necessarily in the mix here, but they might as well have been. You can hear almost all the big players from all of these different rap groups and the tenets of the native tongue, which is that consortium of rap artists in the alternative rap genre of the moment. So Doing Our Own Dang gives a platform to all of those artists because inevitably over the next 2 to 3 years, all of them are going to come out with their own albums and proliferating that sound even further and solidifying the territory of alternative rap being completely different than gangster rap. So that track is fundamental on our rap journey. So give that one a listen. If you like that, keep going because Jungle Brothers are fantastic and the rest of this album goes along that same vibe. So give the whole thing a listen if you'd like. So next, Kate Bush, The Sensual World. This is also avant-garde pop. The tracks I would call out are The Sensual World, the track, Love and Anger, and This Woman's Work. So I know and honor that 85's album was her year, right? Running Up That Hill was on that album, which was already a big hit for her at the time. But then over the last 5 or so years, it reemerged because it was used in a television show. And as a result, it re-entered the zeitgeist, which was so wonderful for us because Kate Bush is fantastic. But despite the fact that that was her monster album in 85, I didn't even call it out as a conspicuous absence. I'm not even totally sure that it's on the big list for 85. Is that I perceive that this album is just much more put together. It's much more consistent. It's much more confident for her because she already comes across very, very confidently. This one to me just seems like it was her doing her best work, but also pushing envelopes on what was to come for music going forward. And it really does come across in that, like Love and Anger, for example, and This Woman's Work. Both of those are tremendous tracks that I think usher in what we know and understand to be indie music over the next 10 to 15 years, certainly avant-garde. There's even elements of pushing envelopes around alternative music in those spaces. Like there's a lot to love in just those 2 tracks. And then The Sensual World itself as a track is just tremendous by itself too. So not only was this album a pinnacle to me for Kate Bush, but she was also giving roadmaps and indicators to pop artists, rock artists alike, where they can go with some of their sounds over the next 10 years, 12 years, 15 years maybe. So that to me, again, is another great way to end this decade, just giving all these burgeoning artists or artists that have been toiling away trying to figure out what their sound is for a while, a roadmap to success, and I think she's delivering that here. Next, Christy McCall, Kite. This is retro roots rock. I would call it also alt country to a certain extent. The 3 tracks I'm calling out are Innocence, Free World, and Days. There's a lot of 90s facing elements here in this album. Certainly on the singer-songwriter front, on the more casual or soft rock side, definitely on the indie rock fronts. I think that there's just a lot that she's offering here, kind of like Kate Bush was, giving a lot of things and ideas to play around with for other artists as they're navigating through the uncertainty of the next several big sounds to come in the 90s. She's giving a lot of those directions here. Also, the album's really great. What she does here, like on Innocence and Free World, both are really tremendous tracks. They're the first 2 tracks of the album. You really also do get that sense of how she's playing with retro sounds. Sometimes she's veering more in the just straight ahead honoring the retro sounds, and in some cases she's taking them and pushing into alt country directions so that she's being a little bit more current versus just being a little bit more retro focused. So the fact that she wavers back and forth is really interesting, and it does give you that sense of what artists in this moment care about as far as bringing those old sounds forward and how they seek to honor them in some cases, and in some cases just use them as a platform to shape current ideas. It's really cool stuff, really interesting. Next, Lenny Kravitz, Let Love Rule. So we talked about Stress last year in '88. Now we're talking about Lenny Kravitz this year. Like I said, Stress, I think, got to the party a little bit before Lenny Kravitz did, just like 10 seconds before in terms of releasing that album, and then he came out. But the reality is that Let Love Rule has so much more going on for it than just being a retro roots rock or neo-psychedelic rock album. I think we all kind of understand about Lenny Kravitz, or if you don't, I'm about to explain it to you, that he's a highly experimentational artist that plays with as many ideas as he could possibly get his hands on that are all steeped in roots tradition or neo-psychedelic, like 50s, 60s, 70s traditions. He aggressively plays with and mashes a lot of those ideas together and tries to create new ideas from them, which is the greatness that is Lenny Kravitz, is he aggressively pushes envelopes by reaching back toward all the little nuggets of greatness from the past and bringing them to the forefront. It's really cool stuff. Sitting on Top of the World, Let Love Rule, Mr. Cab Driver. So Sitting on Top of the World and Let Love Rule, the track, both are huge hits for him. Obviously, he's got a bunch of hits on the way that we haven't gotten to yet, but these are two really great early hits for him, so give those a listen. And then Mr. Cab Driver is another really great one, so give that one a listen too. He's really dictating one of the major directions that roots rock is going to go from a retro perspective over the next at least 5 years. And so giving this one a listen is really great stuff because he launches a lot of really great stuff out into the stratosphere, hoping that some of it catches with other people and that he can successfully tap into that listener market while at the same time giving them indicators of what could be or what could be new, what could be great, what could be interesting at the same time. So he's giving a lot of good ideas and inspiration and interest to a lot of different populations at the same time. So expertly, because the whole album is super cohesive, and yet he's giving so much to so many different groups of people. It's amazing stuff. Next, Meat Beat Manifesto, Storm the Studio. This is absolutely IDM electronica. I don't think anybody could confuse it with anything else but that. It's absolutely dance music, but it's more intellectual. I think that there's a little bit of turntablism going on there. I think you can hear some of its roots back in the early days of DJing and turntablism and where it's gotten us to today. It's very obviously dance music from the club too. It also sounds like electronica from the 90s, 100%. We're so close to the 90s at this point. Albums like Storm the Studio were the things that were launching this brand of electronica into the music sphere and giving either other DJs who have been in the clubs for ages trying to figure out a way in order to make their own EP, giving them an indication on how one could do that with this album, because from this, it's going to be year after year after year, we're seeing some kind of electronica studio albums coming out that have a roadmap to them, where previously it's possible the DJs in the club were sitting there thinking, how am I supposed to put all this stuff that I'm just doing live every night into a cohesive, logical package? And Meat Beat Manifesto are giving a roadmap to those DJs. And so because of that, we're going to start to see more because of albums like this. So the things actually that I want to mention here, much like Manuel Goching from several years ago, this is not necessarily one entire idea that strings along several tracks to the very end of the album. There are 4 blocks of a part 1, 2, 3, 4 in Storm the Studio. So I'm giving you 3 part 1s to listen to, and if any of these 3 are interesting to you as part 1s, you can give the rest of the parts, part 2, 3, 4, a listen, because it's one cohesive idea. Now, I do also believe that the entire album itself is one overarching idea that is connected by these 4, let's just say, chapters. But on the whole, just give these 3 listens. So God OD, part 1, Strap Down, part 1, and I Got the Fear, part 1. All 3 are really great flavors for what Meat Beat Manifesto is bringing to the table in this moment. This is critical electronica music. We are moving closer to the mainstream with albums like this. We are getting very, very close to being on trend because of albums like this. So give at least God OD Part 1, which is the first track on the album, a listen, just so you get that flavor. If you like what's going on here, give those other 2 recommended tracks a listen. And if you like any of them enough to listen to the rest of those parts, go give them a listen, because this is fundamental stuff for your education and knowledge about the evolution of electronica music. So this is fundamental. Next, 9 Inch Nails' Pretty Hate Machine. This is industrial metal. Terrible Lie is a really excellent example of what industrial metal sounds like. Give it a listen, and when you hear it, you go, okay, I kind of get what you're saying when you say it's industrial metal. It sounds like Trent Reznor is using industrial sounds from his synths in order to replicate what it sounds like to play music in a smelting factory. Down in It and Sin, all three of those tracks are tremendous. They're all pretty fundamental for early Nine Inch Nails and the genres to come. One thing I will say about this, if you're not particularly familiar with industrial metal or Nine Inch Nails or anything that comes after Nine Inch Nails in this arena, is that it kind of sounds like evil hair metal. Like, it definitely has callbacks to Pyromania or Slippery When Wet or Out of the Cellar by Rat, but it's got an evil, dark twinge to it that's like a dark flavor that seems kind of evil or grimy. And that's what makes this brand of metal that goes into the 90s and continues to evolve and turn into Marilyn Manson and things like that. Like, this is the kind of stuff that started it all. This is really amazing stuff. I would also encourage you to listen specifically to the track that I called out, Sin, because that will absolutely help ground you in your place and time in the trend lines of where we're at with metal, just to kind of check in, because this very much sounds like metal music from the absolute end of the 80s into the next several years going into the early 90s. And like I said, it'll continue to evolve, but this is a really great track just to help ground you in where we are right now in the journey. And Trent Reznor is a genius, so give him your ears. Next, Pixies' Doolittle. So we already talked about Pixies a couple years ago. This is just more fundamental work from them. They actually evolved considerably off of their last album, which is amazing because I perceive, and many perceive, that they were aggressively pushing the envelope around multiple waves later post-punk alternative rock music, and they're just continuing to go in that direction. We call it second wave alt rock. It's alt rock fundamental, absolutely. And they're continuing, like I said, to usher in what we're going to start listening to over the next several years in the 90s. So the tracks I call out: Debaser, Tame, and Wave of Mutilation. There's a lot of reasons to love this album beyond just the quality of the music itself, because it's really fantastic stuff. They clearly have softened up several things. They're becoming a lot more melodic than they were in their previous album. So it says to me that they are continuing to ask themselves how they can change and shape and get more accessible, but also keep their message clear at the same time. So they're asking themselves these really hard questions that every thoughtful artist should be asking themselves. How do I stay true to my vision while also making it easier for me to connect with more people on this message? Like, that's the whole reason any of us are doing any of these things, right? So beyond all of that, which is great, and you could definitely hear it in those three tracks, is the context around this album. And you can really detect the context just by listening to those three tracks, what they're singing about, and also how they're singing it. Because to me, listening to these tracks, it's so clear that they've gotten popular, and as a result, whomever is managing, producing, whatever, them, to make this album, are encouraging them to lighten up, to become more accessible, to seem more popish than they were before, to tone down the scary stuff and focus more on the easy to consume stuff. Like, Debaser is a really great track in that regard, right? You're thinking about debasing yourself for the sake of popular culture. And so they are in a highly cutting way talking about how they are definitely trying to debase themselves for the sake of selling records and getting more popular. It's like a late stage, the money will roll right in sort of situation. Tame is another really great example. Like, in the track itself, they're just screaming about how tame they are right now, which is hilarious. And again, it's totally self-effacing. It's totally irreverent. It's definitely got that punk thing going on where clearly somebody somewhere said, you know what, you guys should become a lot more tame because then you'll sell more records. So they said, okay, we're going to make a track that's about us being tame, but we're absolutely insane about it. And then Wave of Mutilation is just another really great example of somebody telling them that they should become more accessible. And so they make a song called Wave of Mutilation. It's really fun, amazing stuff. And it clearly shows that they are continuing to honor that punk counterculture trend of, yeah, it's really nice that we all want to become straight-laced and get day jobs and put on suits and look presentable and everything. But at the end of the day, we have a message, we have a vision, we are counterculture. And so expecting us to be these people is ludicrous. So you could either get on board with us or the next time you tell us to be nicer, we're going to make an even scarier record just to stick it to you. So it's really funny, great stuff. This is a pretty fundamental album for Pixies. So give this one a listen just because of how entertaining it is. Just on that. It's really great stuff. Next, Technotronic, Pump Up the Jam. Hey, we talked about this maybe a year or two ago, right? We were talking about I'll House You by Jungle Brothers and how that track, I'll House You, the samples that they were used were like samples of samples of samples. So that sample shows back up in Pump Up the Jam, the track within the greater album. This is EDM. This is electronic dance music, 100%. It's house music, obviously, right? Because it's house. I don't think that anybody that ever was asked the question that knew anything about electronic or house music, what is a really, really early example of house music? Pump Up the Jam by Technotronic, period. That's it. That's the one. That's the one that you think of in your mind. You listen to it and you go, yep, that's it. That's the one. What's interesting about this too is that Technotronic is from Europe, so this is another fun indication of how house music starts to aggressively proliferate across Europe, and how it has been for the last several years that actually led to this moment where Technotronic bubbled up to the surface and came out with this monster hit of Pump Up the Jam. It's the next huge leap forward for house and EDM getting out of the club and onto the radio, because I think that everybody who was alive at the time, at least once in their life, heard Pump Up the Jam on the radio. I think that's just a given. Like, all of us at one point or another heard it. So because of that, it was bringing that house concept to the forefront. It was putting it into the zeitgeist. And as a result, did it actually mean that house music and electronica got all the way to the top of the mountain? Like I said, I think that they've got a hand on top of the mountain. I don't think that they're exactly there yet. I think give it one more and they'll be all the way on top. But this was the one that just played over and over and over and over again and got people really excited, at the very least, about Technotronic, which is why I say that electronica is not exactly on the mountain yet, because I don't think that people were paying attention to the genre or the style. I think they were paying attention to this song, which is different. And so because of that, people getting comfortable and used to the idea of this song and what it brought to the table open the door for inevitably house music and the like and trance and everything to certainly get out of the club and get onto the radio, and for house DJs and the like making more albums that were like this, because now there's going to be 100 million of them once everybody realizes that Technotronic came out with a giant hit. All the producers and the publishing houses are going to be looking for artists like Technotronic in order to make money, and so we're about to hit the wave here in about a year or two. So get ready for that. And then Get Up, because Get Up is another, gigantic hit. Like, that was the other one that was on the radio constantly. Not as much as Pump Up the Jam, but Get Up was absolutely on the charts too. So give them both a listen. It's the beginning of house music being everywhere. So let's get comfortable with it, because it's going to be everywhere. Next, Mellow Man Ace, Escape from Havana. So this is West Coast gangster rap, certainly, but it's also Latin gangster rap, which is really great stuff, because up until this moment, we've only been talking about black culture when it comes to rap, gangster rap, any of that stuff. But there was this gigantic presence that had no voice, essentially, up until this moment, which was the Latin gangster rap contingent. And so albums like this, Mellow Man Ace, Escape from Havana, gives some representation to a population that I would say certainly was doing what they could to appreciate what gangster rap on the black culture side was giving, but this is giving some representation and voice here too, which in many respects is the beginning of this movement, because before this, like I said, there really wasn't any, and now there is. And again, much like we were saying with Technotronic, it gives a roadmap to artists, to producers, to whomever, that there's money to be made in this specific slice off of the gangster rap genre, even a slice off of the West Coast gangster rap genre that we can find value in, and Mellow Man Ace has given it to us. Mentirosa, Rap Guanco, and Mas Piñon. Both of those are three excellent tracks. Mentirosa is like his big hit from this album, so you may or may not have heard it. It's possible, but it's really excellent stuff. I'm really excited about this specifically because Latin gangster rap and everything that kind of cascades off of that, like inevitably we'll get to reggaeton and stuff. I love those genres, and so because of that, I'm really excited that we're finally at a moment when we've got some serious business gangster rap on the Latin side. It's really great stuff. Super excited about it. So give those three tracks a listen. And then finally, X Japan, Blue Blood. So this is J-rock / symphonic power metal. This to me is just tremendous J-rock, period. But regardless of the fact that it's from Japan, it's really awesome power metal. It's awesome symphonic power metal. It's excellent speed metal. It's just really, really excellent stuff. Their guitar playing is fantastic. The instrumentation is awesome. There's certainly been power metal and symphonic metal that have been going on this whole time, even since back with Venom and black metal and everything. Like there have been Scandinavian evolutions that have been happening this entire time around symphonic metal and power metal and stuff like that. But this one, just for whatever reason, the skill is really, really there. The singing, like the lyrics are really, really there. Also, I'm sure you didn't know this unless you're a huge J-rock file, that X Japan is one of the greatest J-rock bands of all time ever, period, like by several orders of magnitude. So this is pretty fundamental when it comes to the Japanese popular culture music scene, generally speaking. I definitely don't think you need to understand Japanese in order to appreciate the instrumentation and what they're doing here. The tracks Blue Blood, Weekend, and Kurenai, all three are excellent. Give those a listen. They're all really excellent stuff. I mean, like I said, just the speed metal components are really great. The symphonic components are really great. They're giving the best of the best when it comes to J-rock for the entire decade, I would say. Like we talked about J-rock for 3 entire seconds several years ago, just giving you an indication of what J-rock was going to sound like for the rest of the decade. So if you want to go back and listen to Loudness's album from 1981 that we kept in the J-pop check-in, that was the standard, right, that we talked about. You could hear how it kind of sounds similar these days in 1989. There's that evolution that exists. It kind of started with Loudness and it's led us to this moment. And this is just peak. It's a pinnacle. And again, much like we've been talking about with a lot of these albums, it's a really excellent way to sort of bookend and close the story on the 1980s by giving you this as saying, this is one of the best J-rock bands ever doing really amazing stuff. So give this one a listen. So because of that, I would just listen to Blue Blood, the track. If you like it, keep going. The rest of the album is like that. If you like that one, maybe check out the other 2 tracks that I call out, Weekend, Kurenai. Both are great. Can't say enough about how amazing X Japan is. It's just fantastic stuff. All right. So one thing I'll call out before we go to conspicuous absences is normally we do a video game check-in, but interestingly enough, there is no video game check-in for this year. For some reason, where there was a lot of stuff going on in 88, a lot of jumps forward, and in 1990, there's a lot that's going on. In 89, there wasn't a lot of releases that year, but then also what was released wasn't particularly interesting or meaningful from a music perspective, so there isn't a check-in. There just isn't. So we can just move right into conspicuous absences for this year. So first, Aerosmith, Pump. This might be disappointing for people that really like Aerosmith, really like hair metal. But the reason that I call this out is, as we were talking about with the second wave of hair metal, or hair metal in general, on the way down, Aerosmith definitely does do an excellent job evolving off of the doldrums that they've been in for the last, at the very least, decade or 2 decades, where they did some amazing stuff at the very beginning of their journey. And then there was a lot of drugs, and then they sort of came out on top and did Pump and Done with Mirrors and stuff like that. And then they became fundamental to 90s hair metal. But I would say that this album, while at one time putting a very fine point on the end of hair metal, is still signaling the end of hair metal also. And so because of that, it's not fundamental stuff. Like Steven Tyler is a completely and utterly distinctive sound, especially this era in the late 80s and early 90s. This is the Steven Tyler that we all probably know and understand these days. Like that persona, that sound in his voice, all of that stuff is fundamental, and it comes up in Pump. And there's several tracks that are wildly popular, some of their most popular ever. But again, it's not really pushing envelopes very much. It's really Aerosmith figuring out how to take the sound that they had way back in the late 60s, early 70s, and update it for this moment of hair metal, which is already on the way down. And so is it really great stuff? Is it a little bit like a really genre-defining album at the very end of the genre's run, just to kind of give it a send-off? Yes. But because of that, is it possible that Aerosmith could have gone beyond that and did even more with that? Possibly. But because of that, that's why it's a conspicuous absence in this case. Like, is it good? Yes. But is it just really kind of a send-off from a band that was trying to figure out a way in order to leap into current time? Yeah. So It's great, but not innovative, let's just say. Next is Beastie Boys' Paul's Boutique. So this is also kind of a disappointing one because Beastie Boys came out with License to Ill several years ago, and that was like one of the most critically fundamental albums in the entire history of all rap, period. And Paul's Boutique isn't necessarily bad or worse. I mean, it's a conspicuous absence. Like, it's really great. But since the shockwaves of 1988 with Straight Outta Compton and with It Takes a Nation of Millions by Public Enemy, Paul's Boutique in this case seems already to be far behind where the rest of rap is going. And we're not even talking about all the alternative rap that's coming out through Jungle Brothers and EPMD and Eric B. and Rakim. Beastie Boys they're basically essentially doing the same approximate thing that they did in their last record, but they're doing it with a little bit more flair. They're playing with a couple alternative rap ideas, but it's still kind of fundamentally them. And the issue is that in order for them to stay with the wave that's riding out, they kind of needed to leap out even further and be a little bit less of what they were and a little bit more of what needs to be going into the future. And they just didn't in this case. I think maybe in an album or two, they'll go even further and then they'll be back out in the essentials. But in this case, Paul's Boutique didn't go far enough compared to where everything else is in rap right now. And speaking of that, Ice-T, the Iceberg / freedom of speech, just watch what you say. Honestly, this is interesting too, because I think what Ice-T is doing is tremendously ambitious because he's taking what NWA Straight Outta Compton did and is just taking it so much further than that, and not in terms of evolving the sounds, evolving the ideas into the next thing. Like, he's making it even darker, even scarier, even more vulgar than it was before. And I think that in this case, it's so much so committed to those ideas that it comes across disingenuously. And no shade on Ice-T, because, he is amazing, right? He has been amazing for ages and ages and ages and ages. But in this one case, the concern that I have in my mind is that what was seen and understood about Straight Outta Compton was sort of lost. That it was this balance between being entertaining, being interesting, and having a perspective and a message in it that was showing the state of things. And in this case, we're just going into the fantastical, like into the grotesque of what Straight Outta Compton was spotlighting. And so because of that, it's becoming a little unrealistic. If it is realistic, that's horrific and sad and unfortunate, and it might very well be. But we're going too far into that concept for it to become consumable. And so because of that, I think that Ice-T will find that footing that he needs where he starts to merge it just with other different musical elements to find his footing. But in this case, whatever he was playing around with in order to get this idea, I think he just went too far into the grotesque and it just becomes unpalatable. So because of that, it's great, but also not nearly as consumable. So conspicuous absence. Next, Jane Child. The reason that this is a conspicuous absence, despite the fact that it's a tremendous album, Jane Child is fantastic on the whole, is that she's spanning the entirety of all of the different R&B waves that we've experienced since 1979. Up until today. And so because of that, while at once being tremendously ambitious and aggressively merging these R&B elements and trying to evolve out of that into the next potential sound, a lot of it does sound like it's just swirling on these multiple waves of R&B all at once and not having a strong perspective any which way. It's just kind of spotlighting all of them. And we're just supposed to appreciate and honor all of them at the same time. And in that, it comes across as a little muddled or directionless, which is a huge shame because it's clear that she's trying so hard to pursue and seek out and uncover the future of R&B. And it just seems like in this record, she's in real time trying to find it. And that is challenging to listen to in a less palatable way because I just want her to either have her own perspective or just honor any one of those different lanes of R&B and just stick to that and commit to it. But in this case, that's not the way that it's going. It's playing around with too many ideas and not committing to any of them. So because of that conspicuous absence. Next, Lisa Stansfield, Affection. So this is an interesting record because it is certainly R&B. Nobody's going to contest that this is R&B. But it's also very much house music, and nobody would contest that it's house music. So because of that, she's playing with two very powerful ideas here at the same time, which is current wave R&B and house at the same time, but they're not super lining up with each other in one album. It sounds like sometimes we'll do a house track and then we'll do an R&B track, and then we'll do another house track and then we'll do another sort of R&B track. It was like a little Jekyll and Hyde, like there was two very powerful dynamics happening at the same time, creating an album that was not focused on either one of them completely. And so because of that, again, the perspective gets muddled and it becomes a little bit obscured which way she was trying to go with this. And it's frustrating too, because what she puts out there is great. It's just there's a great version of this and then a great version of that, and then we go back to this and then we go back to that, and it's too much back and forth, right? It needs to be one thing. And then finally, The Cure, Disintegration. This is an unfortunate thing to talk about, because we started off with putting The Cure in a conspicuous absence in 79, and then they had an essential album, and now they're back into conspicuous absences, which is unfortunate. And the reason that I say this about Disintegration is one of the things I think I've called out a few different times over the course of this podcast is I personally find quality in music that gets to the point, which is also part of the reason why I generally do not listen to or like or pay attention to intros, because I just want the artist's perspective to get to wherever they want it to get to, so that I'm listening to the message that they want to put out there. Much like writing a novel, I don't want a lot of preamble. I want you to just start giving me your ideas. I want to be put into the moment. I don't want a lot of setup and everything and window dressing. Just get to the point. So because of that, what we're essentially talking about is editing. And in this regard, at the very least, for the first few tracks of Disintegration, and then even for the really popular track that they came out with this year, it sounds like it's really lacking thoughtful editing. Not in terms of the tracks are too long. I mean, the tracks are legitimately too long, but it definitely doesn't seem like The Cure is committed to the listener's time being valued. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of tracks in which Robert Smith is certainly putting out the great lyrics and painting the picture and everything, but it just comes across as they're not getting to the point fast enough. And there's like a lot of empty space between some of the stuff. Like, it's just, again, the editing is not very clear there. But to me, the thing that comes across most clearly in this album, despite the fact that, I mean, I do enjoy it still, right? Because it's The Cure, Disintegration is one of their highly popular albums. It just doesn't seem like it's very well edited and could have been shrunk. Every track could have been shrunk down by like 70% and still been just as great. So, having said that, what did you all agree with? What did you disagree with? Did you disagree completely about what I just said about Disintegration and The Cure? Maybe he was entirely respecting everybody's time and I have no attention span. Maybe that's totally possible. Or did you agree that Technotronic began all house music because it was all over the radio in 1989, 90, and 91? Maybe. Do you agree that R&B is tremendously in flux right now and can't seem to land on any one idea or concept, however obscure it might be? Maybe. What did I miss? It's the end of the decade. Have I missed anything this year? Probably. There was a lot going on in 89 that was ushering in 1990, and I absolutely am certain that I had to have missed something that was important. What did you learn? I'm curious to hear what you learned. Are you learning something about alternative rap? You know, maybe you were all about gangster rap, but you never really thought too much about Jungle Brothers that it ushered in, you know, Brand Nubian and Tribe Called Quest and Money Love and everything like that. Are you learning stuff about that? Hopefully. It's fundamental stuff. You're learning something about pop country, that what Clint Black was doing in 1989 was essentially a exact number by number roadmap for most of the country music that's going to come out for the next 40 years. Did you learn that? You could probably go listen to what's current today and listen to A Better Man and say, yeah, that's basically the same song over and over and over again. Except Clint Black kind of did it first. So there you go. So as I said at the beginning, make sure to check out our Essential playlist that has all the tracks that I talked about in today's episode. Also, make sure to check out our big list if you're interested in listening to the albums that I referenced today, or my 6 conspicuous absences, or any of the other albums that I decided to keep for this year. Please make sure that you join us again for our season finale next week. We're doing the 80s wrap up. Very exciting. I can't wait to do it. It's going to be a long episode, I think. There's a lot to talk about. Make sure to rate us and comment wherever you are listening to this. Make sure to find us on Instagram at Not Scary Just Music Pod. Subscribe. We got to make sure that anytime that we're coming out with surprise episodes where we're interviewing artists that I've been referencing in the episodes, that you find out when it's coming out, because it's not consistent. It's not a given. And so you got to find out when we drop those episodes, because they're usually a surprise. They're a surprise to us. Make sure to tell your friends, tell your music listening communities, tell your neighbors, tell your enemies, tell everybody. Tell nobody. Well, no, don't tell nobody. Tell anybody you want. Because at the end of the day, as we've often said, we're all trying to appreciate this music together, and we're trying to bring more people together to listen to some of this stuff that maybe they never thought twice about listening to, like house music or alternative rap or pop country or gangster rap or video game music or J-pop or anything that we've been talking about here over the last season or so. And all we can do is invite them into this community that we're building and inviting them to think about how none of this stuff that we're listening to is inherently challenging. Maybe you haven't heard it before. Maybe you have heard it before, but you only gave it a passing notice and you never really dug in on it. Maybe you were judged for liking it, or maybe you judged somebody else for liking it, but you never really gave it the time of day. I mean, engage with this stuff thoughtfully. Ask yourself these critical questions of, do I like this or don't I? Why? What emotions are being elicited in my body that is making me feel something when I listen to this music one way or another? Because I'll guarantee you that at the end of the day, that emotion that you're feeling in your body very seldom will be fear, right? Because with the exception of some of this stuff that might be a little bit challenging to hear because it elicits feelings of injustice that are happening, be it in one culture or another, despite all of that, none of this stuff is scary. It's just music, right? Thanks for listening, everybody.